All right, let's start. This looks like 35 people. All right. So hi, my name is Kurt. We're going to talk today about creating effective presentations. And as with a lot of things we discuss, this is a very vast subject. So we're just going to kind of scratch the surface a little bit, but hopefully you'll still walk away with, some concrete things and some, we'll say, softer skills that you can apply over time. So here's kind of the agenda. We're going to talk about, in rough order of how things happen when you're prepping a presentation. First, we're going to talk about psychology. Then we're going to talk about the content of a presentation. And then finally, we're going to get onto the visuals. So really, it isn't until step 3 in your process that you should even open up PowerPoint. Everything else should be prior to that happening. Then we'll talk about iteration. And I'll give you some useful links and resources that you can use if you want to explore more or learn more things or have new tools. Sound fair? Awesome. So first we're going to talk about psychology. We'll start with yours and then we'll talk about theirs. There's a number of different taxonomies of types of presentation, but in my mind, there are 3 types of presentation because it's about what you want to accomplish. So I divide them by informative, persuasive, and inspirational. Basically, are you trying to get someone to know something, to do something, or to feel something? Now, obviously, as with all taxonomies, there are blurred lines here. Every one, it contains the other 2 somewhere. But a big through line that you'll hear during my presentation today is that really you want to narrow things down to one objective. At least with most presentations, but particularly with persuasive presentations, which is what we're going to focus on today. And again, we could do a separate training on the informative, we could do a separate training on inspirational, but generally speaking, most people in a business won't necessarily do a lot of informational presentations, and as much as I love TED Talks, they aren't really appropriate for a business setting, usually. But pretty much everybody in this room and everybody who isn't in this room will need to use persuasive presentations if you kind of want to have an impactful career about anything, because you need to persuade anybody who has a boss needs to persuade that boss to do something. So even if you never sell to anybody, you need to know how to do a persuasive presentation. And even if you are the boss, you need to know how to persuade your board of directors. So this is the skill that is pretty widely used and widely needed. So that's what we're going to focus on today. A lot of the tactical stuff we'll get to towards the end, the design stuff, that affects all 3 types of presentations here. But as far as the content and way to structure things, we're going to focus on persuasive. Is that okay? So first is your own psychology. No, that was your psychology. Second is their psychology. So with persuasive presentations, I'm going to assume you're talking to some kind of decision maker. And so this is the very first point. In sales, they often call this discovery, which is sometimes you do your own research and sometimes you just try and anticipate what other people's concerns are going to be. So this is the discovery phase. You know what you want to accomplish. For the purposes of this presentation, we want to persuade a decision maker to do something. So now we have to brainstorm, where are they coming from? What's going on in their mind? So the first and most important thing, and again, the reason I'm going to spend some time on these is because this is where assumptions come into play the most, and usually a presentation goes bad before the person starts presenting because they've failed to take things into account, failed to consider things, failed to challenge these assumptions or even articulate these assumptions. So why are they watching in the first place? They accepted the meeting. Why? There's got to be a reason. They're anticipating getting something out of it. Maybe at the very least, they're anticipating you leaving them alone forever. Or they're anticipating fully saying yes and agreeing to whatever you want. The spectrum is between those 2 things mostly. But they are hoping to make their life better somehow. Anticipate what that is. In general, you'll go far in life helping your superiors make their own lives easier. How do they feel about the main message? So this is somewhat related to the first, but not totally, because you're going to be trying to accomplish something, sure, but you're also going to be talking about some things. So if we're talking, about if it's a sales pitch for healthcare, we're talking about our data or selling into healthcare. Different people have different feelings about that. Is healthcare their most important vertical? Is it just a side thing? If you're trying to pitch an initiative to your supervisor, is this just kind of one more thing? Is this something they've been asking of you for a while and you're only just getting to? They're coming to this with expectations and baggage. How much knowledge do they have? In general, if you're not a very adept presenter, especially a persuasive presenter, you assume people know more than they know. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it is better to err on the side of reiterating something that people know so that we're all on the same page rather than assuming they know something. And again, on the sales context, you can assume your ISR talked to them about something, probably not a safe assumption though. And the pitching to your manager context, you can assume they know your day-to-day workload and how this will help that out a lot, but that's not a very safe assumption either. And what possible questions will they have? I like to do, and I show it a little bit later, I like to do the cynic test or the skeptic test, which is, we all know those people who nothing's ever good enough for. They see like ulterior motives to everything. They usually make they're very entertaining people to sit next to in meetings, in big meetings at least, because they usually have a comment about everything. I often try to embody that person of what are all the things that person might say about what I'm trying to talk about or accomplish, and you can really go far with that. Imagine someone trying to roast you and anticipate those a little bit. And moreover, on a broader scale, what worries them. So we have kind of at the start, what do they want? Usually most wants are tied to a fear as well. Not to get all Buddhist, but aversion and attraction are the same emotion. So if they want something, that also means they're afraid of something. What is it? And again, I'm not saying use their fear to sell them. I'm saying this is how you need to understand who you're talking to before you even start writing an outline. During this process, it's a discovery process. It's really important you actually take notes about this because you will forget. And also just the act of taking notes typically makes your mind work and you think even more in depth about what you're talking about or what you're writing about. And so that's kind of in general things you want to think about discovery. And to give you my own personal experience with, I've been in HR for 10 years, almost always reporting directly to a chief executive. So I have a fair amount of experience with executives, and this is just my experience, but it's been pretty consistent. So executives are always high level. They like to see everything at a very high level. Like I said, you live and breathe it, they don't. A thing that if something goes wrong in your job, it could ruin your entire day or week. It's not even a blip on their radar. And that's not to say they're better than you, it's just they're dealing with problems. They're dealing with a lot more of different types than you are. So it's super important that you don't assume things, like I said. At the start, they need context, memory jogs. Have you talked about this before with them? You might very clearly remember the last time you talked about this with them. They probably don't, because they have a lot of high-level discussions about initiatives with a lot of people over time. So jog their memory and remind them why it matters. Why are we spending our time on this? Hopefully you can remind them why it matters with something they've said in the past, because that's not why it matters to me. It's this is why you told me this matters to you. That's a big lever you can use. So they're high level, but they're more like falcons than they are eagles, not evils. So eagles are very, this is just a weird analogy, but eagles are very known for soaring for long distances. They don't flap their wings, and that's kind of how they do. But executives are more like falcons. Falcons they're raptors. They dive bomb. So the peregrine falcon's the fastest animal in the world because it gets to like 200 miles per hour in its dive bomb, maybe 200 kilometers per hour. Either way, they can get wicked fast in their dive bomb. So executives tend to be like that. They want a very high level. They don't want to be bothered with details until they really, really want details. And that's just, there's no getting around that. So you could pretend like that's not going to happen, or you could anticipate that they're going to dive bomb, even though you don't know where. So the best way to do this is to, again, for the presentation part, keep it all high level, because that's where they're comfortable, but in the background, have the minutia ready. And in general, don't offer them minutia that's not asked for. There's lots of reasons not to do that. A, if you give someone something they don't want, they'll probably get annoyed by it. B, you could be opening yourself up to scrutiny that you don't actually want them to scrutinize. And C, it can derail the entire discussion. Again, you have one thing you're trying to accomplish. If you get in the weeds, you're just not going to accomplish that thing. So you want to have all the backup that you anticipate them needing, have it ready, have it open in another tab or whatever. Have a folder for this presentation on your desktop that everything's there and the folder's open, but none of the files in the folder are open. So if they ask for it, it's right there. Also, you win some bonus points because if you anticipate concerns and you have it ready right there, that shows them lots of things. It shows them that you have your stuff together, but it also shows them that, oh, this isn't just a random pitch. This person has thought about what I want. They've anticipated what I want. And so you might actually avoid further dive bombs because since you were ready for that first one, they can assume you've also looked into the details of the other ones. So those dive bombs first, the first one matters the most because it will not dictate, but it'll influence whether or not you have more dive bombs. And last but not least is they don't like blue sky. Or at least they don't like a blank page. I see this all the time where someone wants something from an executive and they pitch them an idea and then say, what do you think? Which is great for a hallway conversation, but if you're actually trying to achieve something or move a needle, never give an executive a blank page. So if you want them to come up with a way of implementing an initiative that you want, you should come up with some ways to implement that initiative, give them a couple of them, and then say, which do you want? Go nuts. So in other words, you want to give them many different instances, and I say a little bit later in this presentation, you want to make it easy for the person you're trying to convince to say yes, which means remove as many barriers as possible. So if what you need to happen next is an executive writes an email to a person you need them to write an email to, write the email for them. Send them the email and say, just got to sign it and put your name and say from you. If you just need a signature from them, don't email them and again, this depends on, your mileage may vary, it depends on the situation, but if you need a signature for someone, don't email them a thing saying, please sign this, print it out, leave it on their desk with a pen and a sticky note showing them where to sign. So you want to remove as many barriers as possible, and when someone doesn't want to do something, anything can be a barrier, right? So, and that's true of me, right? If I don't want to work out, the fact that I ate lunch 20 minutes later than usual might be the barrier to me working out. That's just how it works. So you want to make it easier for them to say yes and eliminate those barriers. So again, that's just my experience of working with executives, proposing lots of ideas to executives. And also, I mean, I'm not a very high level person, but I'm often pitched myself. And people often ask me for help, but don't come to me with anything. And I often go through that mentality of like, well, what do you want me to do about that right now? I'm happy to help. I like helping. That's Dale Carnegie 101. People like to help each other, but make it easy for me to help you. Questions about that?
Yeah. Kind of minute detail, but would you say that providing, like for initiative, providing options on how to implement it, but also saying like, or do you have anything, any additional ones you'd like to add? Would you add that in as a plan?
I wouldn't. It's implied. It's understood. Another thing is, again, they're birds of prey. They're not scared to go after the thing they want, right? So again, it is a minutia, but I wouldn't say that. Again, because you're basically saying here are two non-blank pages, and oh, here's a blank page, and that might distract them again. Other questions? Cool. So that's the psychology part of it. Next is the content. And again, we are not making slides yet. So I don't know if, I mean, I'm sure everybody here did research papers in school. Honestly, I approach this very similarly, which is I brainstorm and gather as many things as I can, anticipating that I'll only use half of it. Again, there's lots of reasons for that, because you want to have the backup when you need it. You want to know what you don't know. Sometimes you learn something that turns out not to be true and you throw it away. But I'd become a bit of a pack rat when I'm preparing a persuasive presentation like this. So obviously the very first thing you go to are those discovery notes you just took. You also want to gather how has the idea been vetted. So an example is, so here's an example. So the beginning of this year, we did a pilot for LinkedIn Learning. And at the end of the pilot, we went to the executive team and said, so we want to roll it out to the company at large. And part of that was us describing our pilot. So it's great that we have all these, statistics about how learning is important, but we can say concretely, here's our people's experience of it. So that's a way the idea has been vetted. And again, generally speaking, executives are very risk averse. Even the risk takers are pretty risk averse. They just like to take risks about one thing. And so one of my CFO I used to work for, we were trying to pick a software, and he said, nobody ever got fired for going with Adobe, right? So you want to eliminate as much doubt as possible because they don't want to get in trouble for taking a chance. So you just reduce their perception of what the risk is. So that's how a way to reduce that. A really big one, and again, this is one that especially generally salespeople who are trying to sell something, they do an okay job of putting a timeline on things, but internally, people tend to be terrible about this. They tend to be terrible at saying, why does this need to happen now? Because the very fact that it hasn't happened yet means the house isn't on fire. Apparently, we don't need to do this yet. If we needed to do it, why wouldn't we have already done it? So you have to overcome that objection early on and plan how you're going to overcome that objection. What is so special about today that I need to act on it? I have 1,000 things to do today. Is this a nice to have? If it's a nice to have, we'll get to it later when times are better, which they never are. So come up with why they can't put this off. And again, with sales, you could do, there's the deal, it's the end of the quarter, your discount runs out. That's an easy one. But again, that one's more about you than about them. More about them is, if we provide the value that we've convinced you that we provide, every week you don't sign up is X dollars in revenue lost. That's a compelling why not wait, because they have numbers to hit. They don't care if you're hitting your numbers. They have numbers to hit. So every week you put off translates into this many dollars lost. That's why now is the time. Also a big one is what I talked about before. What would the cynic say? Anticipate your weaknesses. This is such a huge thing. And I think both in internal selling and external selling, because it's all selling, folks, you never stop. We always want to pretend like we're perfect. And that pretty much never works. At best, you come off like you're a little full of shit or you're a little naive. Because someone who's not full of shit or naive knows that there's no perfect solution. So it's best rather than setting off the bullshit meter, which will make them want to dive bomb and find out where it is that they're smelling that, just hang a lantern on it and say, there's some imperfections with this solution. Here are these imperfections, I gave you two solutions, right? So here are the imperfections with this one. Here are the imperfections with this one. Life's a trade-off. These are the things you're trading off. And by showing them that you've thought about reasons they wouldn't want to do it, it signals to them that, again, you've done your research. Again, you know what their problems are, not what your problems are, but what theirs are. And it signals to them that you've probably done your own research in the past, so they can trust your judgment. And if your judgment is we should do that, you're priming them to say, okay. Does that make sense? And also, information you should gather are stories. And so I have a quick note on stories. There's, at this point, it's like a running, not even a running gag, just a joke. Anytime a politician gives a speech, they talk about, how they met this person in the Midwest who had X and Y problem, and everybody just kind of rolls their eyes. It's, it's been lampooned so many times at this point. It seems like that's a sappy thing to do. And it kind of is. But a story doesn't have to be that. A story can just be any data point that you can tell a story about. So I gave a few examples here. These are stories, right? I was just reading an article yesterday about blank, about this company. They're in the process of this. That's a story. I mean, there are good and bad ways to tell that story, but that's still a story. And some other examples like if you're doing an internal one, that nearly every company I've worked with has done blank. So if I, for example, am trying to start or trying to transition our company to doing like pay grades or pay scales, I would say basically every company that I've researched and every company that I've worked with that's gone over 200 employees has to incorporate these for scalability and blah, 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 blah. That's a story.
I was just going to say in CSM land, saying like my other clients of the similar,
Yep.
whatever it is, I've thought to with, and all of a sudden you hear the bird up.
Yep.
So listening again, it's a huge.
That's exactly right. It's definitely a win situation, and not just CSM land, but I mean sales too. Like especially if you kind of specialize in a vertical, you can you talk to their peers all the time, and we are social animals. So if they know that their peers are doing this, then there's a lot of social pressure for them to do this. And so you could say, that's a great concern. I was going to get to that a second because I was just talking with, I don't know, Genetech about it yesterday, and they had the same concern. And after I showed them what I'm about to show you, their concern was overcome as well. So that way you're already priming them to be like, oh, again, you're reducing risk. My neighbors are doing it, probably okay for me to do it. I like this quote a lot, that the whole point of trying to convince someone to do something, if you think about it, is trying to get them to buy an image of the future. So when you're preparing, what is the image you're trying to sell them? Again, this is internal sales and external sales. What are you trying to convince them of? Obviously, you're trying to say it's going to be better when. Help them picture it. And again, we are verbal animals, so we picture things in terms of stories. So if you want them to picture, for the LinkedIn learning thing, go back to that example. We could be a company where people only learn a couple times a week in a classroom, or we could be a company where we have a learning culture where anytime somebody wants to know more about something, they have instant access at their fingertips, where they can easily share and recommend things. So you're building a picture there. And that's what convincing is building the picture, getting them to want that more than whatever they have right now. So I'm a big believer in thinking of stories ahead of time. In any kind of persuasive environment. Thinking of things off the cuff is tough, and also it might backfire, frankly. So you want to be a little bit thoughtful about that. And so once you've done all your gathering, just like with a research paper, ideally you use less than half of what you gathered, because you haven't even outlined yet. You're just brainstorming, putting a bunch of stuff on paper, getting quotes, getting research, getting data points, and then who knows if you'll use it. Err on the side of brevity, because according to no one ever was a presentation, a persuasive presentation too short. So this this usually really works well when paired with the approach that I told you about a little bit before, which is have the backup ready, but don't have it present. So you can keep things short and sweet if you know that should you need to elaborate on something or dive deep into something, it's ready. Typically when presentations ramble on, it's because they either didn't put a lot of preparation into it and create an outline in the first place, or because they're not confident that the message speaks for itself. So you want to make sure the message speaks for itself, and if for some reason you missed a connection in that chain for helping it speak for itself, then you can fill in at the time. So we have our data gathered. Now we're going to talk about the outline. I'm keeping this part very broad because A, it depends on what you're trying to convince people to do, and B, it's just very circumstantial. But I will say I'm going to highlight the things that get most often ignored. The first is the preamble. There are probably better ways to say that, like introduction, but I just really like the word preamble. I don't think it's used often enough. I think, actually, we're gonna watch a video really quickly that makes a point better than I can make it, because it's Simon Sinek. Where is it? Sorry, 1 second.
What I want you to do is go write an outline. Now here's a little trick. Our mind is we actually think constructively, not destructively. If you think about how we write PowerPoints, for example, what we do is we tend to have a PowerPoint, and we sort of say at the top of the page, sort of like budget or something like that, and then we make an argument, and at the end, at the bottom, we put the conclusion, the big reveal, right? And this is what we do when we do these things. Go do that as you normally would. And then when you're done with your outline for your talk, simply reverse it all. So it's sort of different than most people think. They think they have to build an argument to get to the end, produces a ta-da. And the process that I espouse is start with the end in mind and then deconstruct it. So there's no ta-da. There's no reveal of the curtain. What ends up happening is the audience starts to understand themselves as you deconstruct and reconstruct the image, and then basically we'll end up where you started.
So I really like that concept of flipping the ta-da, right? This goes back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier about how right now we're talking about a persuasive presentation, right? Some presentations you want to take them on a journey. You don't want them to know where they're going to end up because the reveal is part of the experience. But with a persuasive presentation, you always want them to come back to the point. And they can't know the point until you've told them the point. So I really like in the preamble just saying outright, before you even begin, thanks for meeting with me today. By the end of this meeting, I'm hoping to have accomplished this. Just say it right out front. We all know it's a persuasive presentation. We're not just gathering in a room for kicks. We know there's a point to this. Just say what the point is. Because that way, from then on, every piece of data they hear, every argument you make, they're putting that into that objective for you. So that way, each of your points is actually doing double duty. A, you're constructing an argument, but B, your points are feeding back to the thesis statement. So I'm a big fan of that. And again, that applies to almost any kind of persuasion. It's funny to me how often, when someone's demoing something to me or trying to sell to me, they pretend like they're not trying to sell something to me until the very end. Like, I know we're all adults here. We know what's going on right now. So I would rather you just say at the beginning, thanks for meeting with me. Obviously, I'm going to demo this product. I think it's really useful for you. By the end of the meeting today, I'd like us to have a decision made about blank. Like, I would love if a salesperson said that to me, because I know right in the first 2 minutes of this meeting what is being asked of me. I might not do it, but at least there's no ambiguity. Like, because before then, it's up until that they say that, it's, do you like this product? Would it be useful? Yeah, I like it. It'd be useful. Can I have it for free? Like, that's not the actual question, so don't pretend like that's the question. If you're doing an internal pitch, by the end of this meeting, I'd like us to make a decision on whether or not to expand this trial, this trial to phase 2. And we'll go over reasons why I think we should or shouldn't or whatever. So again, come out right there, flip the ta-da. As also part of this, include definitions and context. This is especially true for the first in a series, so to speak. So if you're externally selling the demo 1, you want to spend a little extra time talking about what does this word mean? What is the context in which definitive lives? If it's demo 2 and this person's already spoken with you, then you don't have to spend so much time on definitions, but you still want to spend time on context. Last time we spoke about blank, blank, blank. The things we left to do were blank, blank. Here we are today to finalize and decide on blank. So, big believer in preambles. If you've been to any of my trainings, you know that I tend to always start my trainings with philosophy, because setting the right shared knowledge avoids a lot of confusion later on. So for the purposes of this pitch, by diversity I mean this, and inclusion I mean that, and equity I mean that. That way, when we get later on in the pitch and I use one of those words, they know what I'm saying. Even if they've used them differently externally, that doesn't become a stumbling block. Again, we're removing barriers for them saying yes. So that's the preamble. Big believer, often overlooked. Next is the agenda. A lot of people hate an agenda slide. So obviously, I'm the one doing this presentation, so you get my opinions. So I'm a big believer in it. And again, it's because, at least for a persuasive presentation, we all know what's going on. Again, like, I'm not going on a journey. I don't want you to blindfold me and give me a ta-da at the end. I want to know, are we going to talk? Is there going to be a place for me to ask questions? Are we going to address X later on in this presentation? If you don't show me an outline, I might get really distracted by a thing I want to point out or ask, and not know that you were going to talk about that in 5 minutes anyway. So I haven't really been listening to you for the past 5 minutes, and all that would have avoided that is you telling me what we're going to talk about over the next half hour, so I know, oh, we're going to get to that. I can pay attention to what this person's actually saying. So in that way, you head off objections at the pass. Again, you let people construct, because we flip the ta-da, right? So we've already shown them our cards. Now if we show them this schedule, they can start building in their mind our argument for us. And again, they can't help but do that. Humans are storytelling creatures. That's what we're made to do. So that's the agenda. Content I'm more or less going to gloss over because, again, it's so situational. But I will say, you obviously have to build an argument. You obviously want your argument to be as tied to concrete things as possible, those case studies, those stories, that data. You want to make sure your argument either explicitly or implicitly addresses those hopes and fears and concerns that we talked about. Sometimes it depends on your style. It depends on the person you're talking to. Sometimes it's actually very effective to just come out and say, I bet, these are the top 2 concerns on your mind. Sometimes it, depending on you and the person that you're talking to, it probably isn't worth doing that, but it is worth saying very clearly, when customers have this concern, when they see this, they tend to be, set at ease. I'm a big believer in repetition, especially because you have one thing you're trying to accomplish, right? That means you typically have one through line or story to tell. But you can't just say one thing because that's a very boring presentation of you saying the same thing over and over. So if you make a point that's to build a larger argument, make the point, then bring it back to the larger argument by restating the argument in relation to the point. So, you can say, again, back to the LinkedIn Learning example. We want to we want to be the best company to work for in Massachusetts. We are at this point, but we want to be the best company to work for. Let's say that's my through line. It wasn't in this particular pitch, but let's just say it is. So I could say, best companies have these 5 things. They have great benefits, check. They have active social life, check. They have whatever, check. And then I say they have a culture of learning, and you just leave that unchecked. And so a culture of ad hoc learning is generally required for best places to work, and we want to be a best place to work. So you come home to that main through line, and then you go to the next point, and then you make the point and you bring it back to the through line. Again, you want to eliminate barriers, and sometimes not understanding why you're saying the thing you're saying is a barrier. And again, people will focus on that because that's how it works. They focus on their barriers. They'll get tunnel vision about the barrier, and by the time they figure it out or just decide to give up, you've already made 2 more points that probably would have, hit it home for you. Obviously, with all these things, pay attention to social cues. Like, some people get annoyed if you are too obvious with things, so pay attention to that, obviously. But err on the side of over-explaining rather than under-explaining. People often say no to things they're afraid of, and uncertainty is basically what creates fear. So better be overly certain than underly certain. And last but not least is the call to action. This is one that's often ignored, frankly, both in external and internal sales. And by call to action, I mean one thing. You're trying to persuade them. It's a persuasive presentation. What is the one thing you want them to do? Now, you can tell them, like, these are the 5 steps that happen after that. That's fine. But you want to say, but this is what needs to happen next. I am a big believer, not just in presentations, but frankly in most meetings I have, before we leave the room saying, okay, who owns what? That's a good way to make sure a meeting wasn't a waste of time. If you can't think of anything that anybody owns because of that meeting, it probably shouldn't have happened in the first place. But with a persuasive presentation, we already know who owns what because you started that in your mind from step 1. What do I want to accomplish? So I want the call to action is, by the end of the day tomorrow, you let me know whether we're going to go forward with this initiative. Sometimes they do punt it back to you. So let's say I want them to commit to going forward with this program, but they want a little bit more data. I wasn't prepared enough with my backup when they asked for it, and they want a little bit more reassurance. And I say, okay, that's fair. I'll get you my reassurance. And then you go back to the call to action, just update a little bit. So I'll get you that within 24 hours. So within 48 hours, you will have a go, no go on this decision. So you want to make it as crystal clear as possible. I think often, kind of again, because we're in the weeds, but decision makers tend to be very high up, we think the next step is obvious. Obviously, the next step is you reach out to me and tell me that you want to see a copy of the contract. That's not obvious. So frequently when I'm dealing with so many different types of vendors, I have to be the one to ask, okay, so who's doing what now? Because I don't like ambiguity, but plenty of people won't say that and will just let it be and let it fall off. And then they don't feel bad when you reach out to them again and say like, oh, this fell through the cracks, and they don't think, well, that wasn't my fault, because people love to not be at fault. So next step should always be clear. There should only be one step. Again, you can let them know what the process looks like, but let them know even more clearly what the next step, the one next step is. And then make it easy to say yes. Again, like I talked about before, eliminate any barrier you possibly can. Even if the commitment is they're going to get back to you by the end of the day tomorrow with an answer, say, great, I will send a calendar invitation so I know your time is blocked. I'll set up the meeting, and I will eliminate every barrier other than you looking at your calendar to see what happens next to say yes. Any questions about kind of the broad outline? Okay, so I want to make sure we're good. So we're 45 minutes through my presentation, and we haven't touched PowerPoint yet. And there's a reason for that, right? PowerPoint can't cover up a bad message. A lot of people try to cover up a bad message with PowerPoint, but it can't cover up a bad message. So we're going to talk about the visuals. So like I said, there's a reason this is last in the game. First discover, then brainstorm, then outline, then a deck. And I will say that when you do things in that order, the actual presentation part is wicked easy. Like it takes no time at all. Not even factoring in if you're using kind of the same presentation, but you're tweaking it a little bit. Like for this, this isn't a persuasive presentation right now, but for this presentation, to make the actual slides I'm showing you, maybe an hour, but all the stuff beforehand is that iceberg that you didn't see. So I was outlining and researching and gathering. So it doesn't take too long to make a presentation, a quality presentation, if you do things in the right order. So we talked about for the presentation as a whole, you want to do the what am I trying to accomplish? That helps you decide what presentation you're doing, what kind of presentation you're doing, and also gives you that focus and that through line. You want to do the same thing with each individual slide. Each slide should really only be trying to accomplish one thing. And you want to make that one thing clear. This is where repetition comes in again. So this slide, I started by saying, starting a presentation comes third in the process. This is why. I've reiterated that like 3 times in this slide already. There are some subpoints that help people buy into the point of the slide, but the main point of the slide is this. And the last point for this particular slide is try to be conversation focused. And the reason I mention that is when you're trying to persuade people, especially decision makers, they're probably not just, well, they hopefully don't just sit back and not say anything, because that's not actually a very good sign. So you don't want to construct a presentation, a physical PowerPoint presentation that dissuades conversation, right? Because conversation is what's going to get you the thing you want. That's how you find out what their objections are, what their fears are, all that stuff that you tried to do discovery. That's how you confirm and deny that stuff. So you want to build with conversation in mind. This is where I'm reiterating that's for persuasive, because if you're doing different kinds of like presentations that are transmitting knowledge, it's different. So here's an example of a short conversation focused slide deck. I forget what company I got it from. I forget. So all it is it has these insights and a couple quotes or stats per slide, but the person creating the deck is planning on spending 5-10 minutes per slide. So each slide is a guidepost in a conversation. You're not really trying to show them something with this slide. You're trying to signal to them, we're going to talk about this right now. Now, obviously, if you also have to show them something like a demo, that's important. You want to do that, but you want to create time for conversation because, again, they're falcons. So if they don't feel like there's going to be time, then they're just going to make time for a conversation, and probably they're going to mess up your flow. They're going to distract whatever point you were trying to make while you try to make your point, rather than just saying, let's have some space. What are your thoughts about this? Here's what I've observed, etc. So obviously we're in a world that uses visuals in PowerPoint, but you don't want to use them just for the sake of using them, right? Generally, there are 3 reasons to use visuals. There's the revelatory reason, which is just a thing that's super hard to say in words. That's the classic, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? There's the explanatory power. This is the one that's most common, especially in like business settings or when you're trying to persuade people. This is just some things are super complicated, and you don't want to make them less complicated because then, well, I'll give you an example, but you don't want to make them less complicated because that would be bad for a different reason, but you want to make it digestible. And a visual is a good way of making a very complicated thing that you can only boil down so much digestible. Typically, if you have more than 2 numbers that you're dealing with in a slide, if you have 3 or more numbers, figure out a way to say it visually. Numbers don't stick very well en masse or in numbers. And then there's the aesthetic appeal. Sometimes you just want to be pretty and make people go, ooh. Frankly, that has a lot of value. I'll give you some third-party sources later, but I think a lot of people, when they open PowerPoint or whatever, they stick to the smart art or whatever's in there. We live in the digital age, guys. You can get anything from anywhere and just pop it into your PowerPoint, or not use PowerPoint at all. So that's the visuals. So here's the example I was giving you of an explanatory visual. So this is a very pretty version of a Gantt chart. So this is showing the timeline to create and implement and ship something. So there's a lot of data here. And this is really Falcon friendly in that this gives you a very clear picture. You know that things are done in 7 weeks. You see the steps, you see how long each step's going to take. Very good high level stuff, but it also gives the detail that someone might want. So if someone wants to turn this slide into a conversation, they can. If they don't want to, if they're just like, yep, I get it, I can look at that, on my own time, it's there. You don't have to change it. But it still has a measure of simplicity, right? Each of these steps, we have step 1, initial client consult, and there's 2 bullets underneath. Probably has more than 2 bullets there, but you still distill it to what's the most relevant to those people. All right, so some guidelines now. We have guidelines for a few different things: slide allocation, font, some other stuff. So guidelines for slide allocation is, like I said, limit each slide to a single core idea. Another point to be made is there's kind of a cult of simplicity, and people interpret that to mean different things. And a very facile interpretation of simplicity is that fewer slides is better. That's not true. Focus slides are better, but fewer slides are not better. I didn't put it up here because I couldn't find a clean version of it, but there's a funny meme going around the internet that shows like Bill Gates in front of a slide that has like 1 billion things on it, and then Steve Jobs in front of a slide that has like 3 Apple symbols on it. And the question is, which is the more effective presenter? Like Steve Jobs, his decks have lots of slides, but each slide has 1, maybe 2 things on them. So you hear these rules of thumb of you should dedicate, for any presentation, you should do no more than 2 minutes per slide, and you should have no more than 15 slides. Those are just someone's opinion. Less is not necessarily better. There's nothing wrong with a blank slide. This is really good if you've made a point, you're building an argument, but you don't want them to be distracted by the slide anymore. So you go back, it doesn't have to be blank, it can be, those title slides I've been using, you can go back to a title slide or some slide that just has 1 word on it. So again, you're focusing them on, here's what we're talking about now. You needed that information before to get us to here, and now we're going to talk about this. That goes over to balancing cognitive loads. So the concept of cognitive load is that your brain can only handle so much at a time. And your brain is dealing with lots of different types of input, so visual, audio, sensory, all that stuff. And your brain actually has to thread all these things at different rates and at different times. So the upshot is, let's say you only have 10 units of cognitive load. If I have a very visually heavy slide, like that one we were looking about with the Gantt chart, that's a very high visual cognitive load, which is fine. But that means you have to offset, let's say that visual slide's using 7 of your cognitive units, you have to offset that by not talking as much. You have to lighten the auditory cognitive load. And when you go to the blank slide or the title slide, that really lightens the visual load, so they're going to pay more attention to what you're saying. So when you're designing the actual presentation, try to pay attention to cognitive loads. Look at your outline. If your outline is very text heavy at a certain point, try and keep the slide simple so they pay attention to what you're saying, and vice versa. If you're showing them a slide with a lot of stuff, give them a minute to process it. They'll probably have a couple of questions, answer them, and move on to a less heavy visually loaded slide. Make sense? Another interesting point that came up in my research was horizontal versus vertical information. This is more if you're developing an infographic, but it's important or useful to think of. And here's an example. So typically, when we think of horizontal information, we think of categories. So, we're used to reading left and right. We think of, past to future. Horizontal information tends to be very high-level category distinction in our brains. And vertical information tends to, again, mimic depth. So usually if you want to simulate both breadth and depth, you want breadth to be horizontal and depth to be vertical. So you actually get in this slide the image of drilling down into, I want to learn more about photography. Okay, now I can get into details. But if I just want to see the overall point they're making, comparing photography to airline digitization, I can get that too. So if you want to make a lot of data more visually appealing, keep in mind the horizontal vertical axis. And again, graphic design is a huge thing, really interesting stuff. I'm not an expert in it, but these are some things that I've noticed are helpful to know. Questions about any of that? Cool. Slide formatting guidelines. I know this is super, super nitty-gritty stuff, but it's actually pretty useful. For some reason, actually this isn't a mystery, but PowerPoint and the like were invented back when widescreen wasn't a thing. So their default setting is 4:3. Their default ratio is 4:3. That's just not how screens are anymore. So you get that like ugly black bar on each side of your presentation. You can just go to PowerPoint, make your default setting 16:9 as opposed to 4:3, and from now on, every new PowerPoint you make is in the setting that makes sense in our new technological world. Between slides, you want consistent layouts. Sometimes you can make exceptions to this if you want to draw attention that this slide's different, but if you don't, then stick with the same layout. Even if it doesn't do exactly what you want it to do, it's better to not have them spend cognitive load on, whoa, this is a weird layout, as opposed to listening to your voice. Keep plenty of white space, simple color scheme. Really, I think a simple color scheme is one with 3 colors that are clearly delineated. This is the primary color, this is the emphasis color, and then this is your tertiary color if you need it. And then 1 highlight color. Questions about these? What about bullets? Bullets are contentious. Obviously I use them. I think they're useful in presentations when you're trying to transmit knowledge. I think just like anything, all things are okay in moderation. I will say I'm a big fan of when I'm making a presentation, and some softwares are easier than others with this. I make one version of the slide in kind of different formats. Like sometimes I do it with bullets, sometimes I do it with an infographic, sometimes I do it with numbers instead of bullets. Just because sometimes the thing you go to first, which in my instance is bullets, isn't always the right answer. If you're trying to do the inspirational talk, the take me on a journey talk, probably shouldn't use them at all. If you're doing kind of on the opposite side, the educational talk, it's kind of hard to get away from them. So yeah, some people live and swear by them. Some people will rather die than use them. It's never hard to find strong opinions about anything. Other questions? Okay. For font formatting, again, very simple rules. Medium sans serif, meaning it's not a silly fancy font. Helvetica or Arial are best. For presentations, at least 24-point size. I think it would be great if PowerPoint didn't let you go below then, but it does. The only time I would go below 24 is if there's an image in there that I want to attribute to someone. But that's the only time I'd ever go between 24. Only use 3 sizes. They can be whatever sizes you want. You pick them, but don't have like text of 5 different sizes in there. A, spends cognitive load. B, it just looks weird. And C, it doesn't, when you put constraints around yourself, it forces you to be a lot clearer in your own thinking. So like if you put a constraint on yourself saying, I'm gonna use bullets, but no more than 3 per slide, that forces you to be clear about what's actually important here. And try not to italicize or underline. If you have to emphasize something, use bold. Italicization and underlining, they look weird, they can mess around with certain fonts, and bold does the exact same thing with none of those downsides. Questions on formatting font? Other tricks, these are super handy when they come in handy, and when you do them, people think you're a genius, but they're very simple. So once you've made your slides, highlight everything and then align the elements. Because whether you can see it or not, or rather whether you notice it or not, your brain notices when things are out of alignment. And Photoshop has this built in. Just go to Format, Align. It'll lock the elements to their own grid, basically. Before you export, embed your fonts. If you're using any font that isn't just bread and butter, you want to embed those just in case the computer you're going to doesn't have that font, then it'll just look really bad. So basically, there's the path to do it. You go to File, Options, Save, and then you check a box. I'm a big fan personally of if I need to use my slides at a different computer, I like just exporting them to PDF and using them as PDFs. It does the exact same thing. You make the PDF full screen and you just hit the right arrow and it goes to the next slide, but that way you know it's going to work the way you want it to work. And obviously you want to iterate. So you don't just create an outline and then make slides and you're done. You create an outline, make slides. While you're making slides, you realize, wow, I have to be a lot more concise about this. And while you're doing that, you make notes to your outline about, well, okay, this can't be on a slide anymore. I should add it to my speaking outline. And then using that outline, you tweak your slides again. So usually it takes, to do a really polished presentation, about 3 iterations of this. Yeah. And last but not least, you don't have to use these or anything, but they're here if you want to reference them. Some useful resources. So there are PowerPoint alternatives. These are both free, up to a limited usage. Beautiful AI is what I'm using right now. It's what I tend to use. And Prezi is a fun one, although Prezi it can be inappropriate depending on what you're trying to accomplish because it's a very visually arresting style. If you want to make infographics, there's some really good infographic template sites, Venngage, Visma, and Infogram. They're all different, but kind of the same. It's just what kind of user interface you like. Visma I haven't played around with a lot, but I'm kind of excited to. I'm a big believer in using stock photography as opposed to like whatever images are in PowerPoint by default. You can get plenty of royalty-free, easily accessed stock photography at Unsplash or Pexels. I have a couple Skillshare classes that I like. One of them is the one we saw a brief glimpse of, which is Presentation Essentials. And there's also a really good one that's just about storytelling. So I mentioned stories, how they're important. This is just a half-hour class about how to craft and tell an excellent story. And 2 great books for this. They're both quick reads. One is The Official TED Guide to Public Speaking. That is more talking about the inspirational take someone on a journey talk, but there's a lot of points in there that go across all kinds of presentations. And then good old Dale Carnegie, he's always good for a book, the How to Develop Self-Confidence and Influence People by Public Speaking. Huge. Dale Carnegie's points at this point we kind of consider to be fundamental and obvious, but I find that people often overlook the fundamentals and the obvious things. Any questions before we close out the presentation? All right, well, thanks for your time, guys. Let me know if you have any questions.